Ryerson's Board of Governors unanimously voting today to change the school's name to Toronto Metropolitan University. This following backlash over its original namesake, Egerton Ryerson, who helped create Canada's residential school system. Toronto Metropolitan was one of 22 recommendations made by a task force meant to examine Ryerson's life and legacy. In a statement issued today, the university's president and vice chancellor said that committee heard from 30,000 people and reviewed more than 2,600 names. For reaction to this, we welcome to CP24 tonight student activist Sam Howden and activist and scholar Cyrus Marcus Ware, as well as Olivia Chow, who is the founder and executive director at Institute for Change Leaders at the school. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Sam, let's start with you. You started the X-University movement when conversations about this name change began back in 2020. So what does this new name say to you?
It's mostly a marketing ploy from the university in order to appeal to outside sources and not actually be accountable to community or transparent to community in a way that we've had productive conversations with.
Can you tell us a bit more about how you experienced the process over the last few years?
Yeah, over the last few years, ever since I've been at the university, I mean, I've had friends in different spaces, from student governance to being activists on the ground, whereby I know that there are conversations that were held behind closed doors. First of all, focusing on the statue as an artifice of the thing that we had to move, and then moving further towards the name as the thing that we had to really shift conversations about in terms of the legacy of, genocide and their overall contributions to public education and having to have these conversations as a community.
So Sam, if the goal here was to promote truth and reconciliation, do you think that was achieved through this new name?
No, I do not. Plain and simple. I don't really think that actually had any kind of productive value at all, because I didn't hear about the name change itself until today in a press release from the Globe and Mail. So I don't think that any of these conversations, whether it be through the survey and the short list of these so-called 10,000 different students that were involved in giving their input towards the university, was really productive in any capacity, because more so what we were asking for was justice for Indigenous people, and we didn't really see that behind closed doors or out in the open.
Okay, Ms. Chow, as the founder of the Institute for Change Leaders at the school, how do you feel about this new name?
Well, we are an independent organization, but supported by Ryerson. It's hard to change by the TMU. Okay, the new name. And we are located right there through the Faculty of Community Services. I rather not talk about the process because that's in the past. The name has changed, and TMU, it can be interpreted. We can get really creative together, mobilizing for change, mobilize to learn. T can stand for team. M can be multiculturalism. I don't know. There's a whole lot of things it could stand for, I am on their mailing list, so I keep seeing a lot of notification, send us the names, etc. So there was a process. If you get on the list, if you want to, you can get into giving them some suggestions and opinions and that kind of thing. TMU, it's sort of okay. I interpret it as being, I love the together piece. Of course, we can pick people that are significant. It could be the Lincoln Alexander. It could be any number of people. But whatever reason, that didn't get picked, we will have TMU then.
So if I'm reading between the lines, it seems like you were surprised maybe this wasn't a namesake. Could it have been in this situation?
It could have been, but I don't want to second guess a whole panel of people. There are people on the panel that I respect, and I just want us to focus on what this university can do. It is diverse. It has students that travel from very far away to downtown. It is creating a law school that hopefully be, and also a medical school. It is like the students that I teach at this university are certainly quite different from the students I encounter at U of T, for example, University of Toronto. So they have lots and lots of needs, and let us focus on what we can do. But because I teach political action, political organizing, of course I would choose to look at mobilizing together,
Okay, fair enough.
power for change, that kind of thing.
Cyrus, let's bring you in on this. This process really started after that statue was brought down last summer. I was there reporting on it. BLM was part of the group of protesters that was there at that time. Do you see this name change today as a victory?
Well, I wouldn't go as far to say a victory, but I would say it's a change that needed to happen. When we first had that beautification process where we put some paint on the statue to remind us that it shouldn't have been there before it was pulled down in that glorious day last year, we were sort of saying, these are monuments to slavery and colonialism, and we need not be celebrating them in our city, in our country, and definitely not at our learning institutions. So it was something that needed to happen. The name needed to change. What I was surprised by was that it wasn't an Indigenous name that was chosen. I would have thought that there might have been more of a turn towards Indigenous place naming and Indigenous naming in this decision. I certainly heard from Indigenous friends today who were also saying I would have thought they would have perhaps chosen an Indigenous name, maybe even using Toronto if they were going to use the word Toronto. So just thinking about that, but I think it was a name change that needed to happen. What I'm interested in, I think what the panelists are saying is how do we move forward? And my question is, what is the re-indigenization of the university going to look like to make sure that there's Indigenous studies, that there's Indigenous curriculum, that there's Indigenous faculty, and that Indigenous students have a place at this new university? And yes, let's call it TMU. I love the idea of making the name acronym into anything that we want it to be. So let's call it Takaranto. Let's call it, movement building. Let's call it universality, or let's call it us. But let's just make sure that there's Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous presence centered in the university if this is what, we're working towards.
I want to bring in Sam on this point because the university's president actually said today, Sam, they didn't choose an Indigenous name because the university, they said, needed a name that would unite people, not really represent a small group of people or community within a community. How does that sit with you, and what would you have liked to see when it comes to the name?
I think that's a common approach to colonization and the ways in which we want to bring people together when we're not actually talking about the landscape or the actual land. It's very much, in my opinion, the way that people take up certain politics around it. It's like, do you even know who the Anishinaabe people are of this territory? Do you even know how to say hello? Do you even know how to say goodbye? Do you know who the Haudenosaunee are? Do you know why we're talking about Takaranto as opposed to other names? I don't really see that happening. And regardless of whether or not you think that it reflects a certain amount of group of people that are coming to your institution, what really needs to be stated here is the amount of information and people who are originally here. And, that includes also actions towards land back and language and placemaking. That is incredibly important.
And there were a long list of recommendations, by the way, that were approved. This was one to change the name. Ms. Chow, the board also approved a change, including a piece on education. I'm wondering, from your perspective, what might that look like on campus, and what kind of impact could that have?
Well, I think the imagining, takes an artist like Cyrus to imagine what is possible. I think the education could be incredibly inclusive, but not just academic information or change, but if we could look at what are some of the key changes that needs to happen in this city. Because remember, this university is right smack downtown, filled with people that are having to struggle with housing, precarious work, um, people that have now come from different resorts across Northern Ontario down to the city and sometimes being lost. And there's so much that this university can do to reach out to people that are more vulnerable to say, look, we need to seek justice. So not just taking a look at the history. What does justice mean? How could we get our faculty and students coming together to make sure there's decent housing and good jobs and all of those things, understanding our history and true sense of reconciliation? That is that could be quite beautiful if we could do that.
Okay, that's the goal, of course. Thank you so much for your time, your perspective on this. We so appreciate this. Cyrus Marcus Ware, Sam Howden, and Olivia Chow. Thank you.